Please listen carefully.
And welcome back to the Focus Target Podcast. This is your host, Smiley, coming at you with Season 3, Episode 87 of Focus Target. I am joined today by my co-hosts, Shy and Van. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Howdy ho.
How are things where you be?
Warm. It's getting hot quickly down here in Southern California.
I bet
It's
it
out of
is.
control. Oh, man.
I bet it is.
It's very nice
Yep.
here.
What is
kinda-
it? Right now it's like 85.
I think we're in like the low 70s.
Oh my god, I wish.
It's kind of cool here. I think it's in the 50s or 60s is how it feels. It has been really rainy in Colorado, which is kind of not unusual for this time of year, but it's like a window of like 2 months where we get rain and that's it. So I'm enjoying that. I like the rain. It's nice for my yard. All right. So today we're going to be talking about skill in gaming. We actually kind of referenced it a little bit last time on the pod. We talked a little bit about, what does it mean to be good at video games, and how does your competency or your skill at games factor into your play styles and the people you meet and how you treat people online and things like that. So we're going to dive into that and kind of give our thoughts on that kind of thing. Before we do that, we have a question of the day. Last time we were talking about kind of what games we were playing, and one thing that came up was trying to finish games. And we have all had some different levels of success with getting actually through to the end of a game. And so the question today kind of harkens back to that, which is which game have you spent the most time trying to finish but have never actually gotten to the end of? And maybe you kind of tying in with that, if it's not the one you spent the most time on, maybe secondarily, which game have you most wanted to finish that you never have? If there's one game you could go back and really try to get to the end of, which one would it be if that's a different answer? So let's start with Shy today. Shy, what game have you spent the most time trying to finish but it's thwarted you?
Yeah, I think it's hard for me to I don't have a definitive answer. I think there's a number of RPGs specifically that I could point to. So I think I will give an answer to each of those because both would probably fit into the first one. But as far as a game that stands out that I've put a lot of time into and never finished is a game by Square Enix. It's not as popular as some of their other JRPGs, but a game called Last Remnant. When it launched, it was Xbox 360 exclusive. It was a squad-based JRPG that had a very funky combat system.
It sounds like it.
Very interesting game. A game I always really like, but just really one of those games where it just started dragging out at the end, and just kind of got slow. And so I've tried playing through that game 2 or 3 times. I think putting 30 to 40 hours at least into each playthrough, and I've never finished it. But as far as your second one, another one is Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 1 is one of my favorite.
You never finished Mass Effect 2?
No, Mass Effect 1 is one of my favorite RPGs, but it's not my favorite game. Ninja Gaiden would be there, but definitely top 3. The first Mass Effect's top 3 game of all time for me, and I've played that game multiple times. But 2, it's so different. They took a lot of the traditional RPG elements away from Mass Effect 1 and made it much more of an action third-person cover shooter. And so I've tried playing through that game 2 or 3 times, and I've never finished. But I know they're releasing the remastered trilogy. I think this month, actually, end of this month, I think is when it's coming out. And I've always wanted to play through the trilogy, but I've never wanted to skip 2 and go right to 3. And so that's a game I hope I am able to play through at some point.
So it's not one of your 4 re-rolls in Horizon Zero Dawn?
No, I think the farthest I've ever gotten in Horizon Zero Dawn was maybe 20 hours in. And I think then maybe there was a 10-hour attempt and maybe yeah.
Yeah.
All right, what about you, Van?
So I was pretty certain this was going to be kind of a boring answer because it was the same one that I gave last week, which was Breath of the Wild. I think I had some 60 hours or something like that. But then I went back and started reflecting. I was like, you know what? It's not Breath of the Wild. It's actually GTA V. So
really?
Grand Theft Auto 5. So I'd done 2 playthroughs. The first playthrough, I literally went all the way to what I can only imagine is the absolute last mission, because based on the type of mission it is, it has to be the last one. So I know it's certainly the last mission, and yet I didn't finish it. So clearly I have a a mental issue with completing games. Like I don't want to
Closing the
lose it.
deal.
Yeah, exactly. To the experience ending. So it's a solid 50-hour playthrough. I mean, it varies. I mean, there's so much to do in Grand Theft Auto, right? If you want to mess around with the cars and complete races and side quests and all that stuff. So the game could vary anywhere from, I'm guessing, probably 40 hours to 100 plus hours. But my first playthrough was like roughly 50. I think it was like 49 hours. Played through it once. Played through it a second time because I didn't want to just pick up on the last mission, because why would we do that? Even though it sounds like a great idea once we talked about it last week. I'll probably do that going forward. But instead of just picking off on the last mission and cheapingly finishing the last mission after a year and a half of not touching the controller, I decided to do a playthrough again. So I did that, accumulated a nice 30, 40 more hours, and then stopped playing again. So it's like I'm probably 90 hours into that game and have not beat the final mission. However, I have played a lot of online too. That time was not factored into that because it saves, by your save data. Yeah, by your actual one you're on. But that's what keeps pulling me away, is like my buddy will hit me up and be like, hey, CKY12A, friend of the podcast, would say, hey, let's let's go do some stuff on GTA Online or whatnot. So then I'll just get pulled away, and then every time I'm playing, we'll just end up doing that instead of playing the campaign. So yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's GTA 5 was a good game. I didn't put nearly as much time as you did. I think I got I mean, I don't know how far into it I got, but I got pretty substantially far. Like I spent a lot of time with all the characters. I think I'd been around a lot of the map, so I was probably later half, but I definitely didn't finish all the quests.
The characters are so good, dude.
They're
That game is
really
amazing.
funny. Yeah, I liked them.
It's a masterpiece for sure.
It's very well. I mean, that's why it's been released on like PS3 and 4 and 5, and
I mean, what did
probably
it
be
get?
on
Was it
PS.
released 6 years ago?
Yeah, it's
Something
like the
ridiculous?
freaking. It's like the freaking. What's that Elder Scrolls
Skyrim.
game?
It's like,
Skyrim.
it's comparable to Skyrim.
It's like Skyrim,
Oh,
where they
smokes.
just keep releasing
Yeah.
it for every new system and don't give us like GTA 6.
September 17, 2013. So it's an 8-year-old
Yeah.
game.
Man.
I was gonna say I think I got it for PS4. I think
But I think it was also one of the most expensive games to produce ever.
That wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I think it was one of the most expensive games ever to make, to the tune of $265 million.
Nice.
$250 million? That just sounds unfathomable.
Takes a lot of
for a video
confidence
game.
to put that kind of money into a video game.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been paying off for 8 years, and they're saying
Yeah.
that online, and that's the whole reason why GTA 6 doesn't have a lot of pressure to come out, is because like the online community is still huge and the game's still getting played a lot, and there's microtransactions in the online community. They said, no man, we're still making a lot of money.
yeah. And if you're making money, why stop a good thing?
Well, they did Red Dead Redemption too. So I mean,
Yeah,
they
they
kind
did
of did
Red-
they did another open world, after it.
Yeah,
Well,
you're
it's
right.
nice. They could have just Maddenized it too with the online portion, right? Sold a brand new game that's basically a slight increase here and there, and made you buy a new thing to keep your online community going, and they did not. So that's cool. I checked. I do have it on PS3.
Oh, nice.
PS3.
Yes.
Nice.
Excuse me.
Bless you.
So yeah. I guess I'll put that up.
That's why you stopped putting time into it.
Well, I mean, no, I mean, possibly. I mean, it was a long
think
time
about
ago.
I don't want
Two
to plug in my
generations, dude.
PS3.
That is 2
Yeah.
generations old.
Yeah,
That's
it's insane.
something else.
All right, well, mine. I don't know if mine technically counts. You guys can tell me if mine counts. So, the game I was gonna pick was Lunar 2: Eternal Blue, and I have beaten the primary game. I've seen the ending, but I haven't ever gone the extra mile and done all the optional dungeons to see the special ending at the end. And so one of the reasons that I have so many is it's somewhat similar to Van. So Lunar 2 is a direct sequel to Lunar 1, the Silver Star story, which is one of my top rated games ever. I love that game. I love to go back through and play through it. And so I play through it, and like that's a 60, 70 hour game in and of itself. And so I play all the way through that, and then of course I want to roll right into Lunar 2 Eternal Blue. And so like I'm already 70 hours deep into a Lunar game when I start, and then it's another 70 or 80 hours to get through Lunar 2. And then the end game is just very like the dungeons are just really grindy. Like the enemies have a shit ton of life and they take forever to kill. and the bosses are hard, and like you do get some cool stuff, like cool items and accessories down there. Like it's cool, but like it just is a real grind. And so like by the time you're done with back-to-back games that are that long, like I keep trying, and like I've gone and like watched, I've seen the ending, like I went and watched it just because I wanted to see the story. One time when I was like, I'm not doing all this, to see the special ending. I'm just gonna watch it online. So I've seen it, but I've never actually gotten there. I've never actually crossed the finish line of that game, which is a real shame because I love the Lunar series. So that's definitely the game I've put the most time into without having officially finished. The second game, I would say, the second part of that question, which game do I wish I would have given more time? Shy, you'll approve of this one. It's Battle Chasers.
Yeah.
Night War. Like that game is so cool, and every time I play it, I'm like, oh man, like it does so many things that I love in an RPG. Like so many things that I would want to put in my own RPG, as far as like the way they have like the completion and like the stats and the kill X number of enemies. Like every time you kill an enemy, like if you hit thresholds, you learn more about them and you get bonuses for. Like I love that. Like it's a great feedback loop, and for whatever reason, I have struggled to actually keep making progress in it. I don't know why. Even when I go back to it, I play it and I like it, but it just doesn't hold my interest well enough. So
you have a lot of games.
I don't know.
You
I have a lot. I have too many games. Yeah, I've been. Go ahead.
Yeah, no.
Please.
I was saying, I wonder if there's a podcast where in here somewhere about playing a game for story or playing the game for like enjoyment of playability.
Like, we already do that.
I feel like we've done something like that. Like why do you play games? I think we've covered that to a certain extent.
We can do it again. Maybe things have changed. I don't know. Enough time passes. We can approach it from a different angle. We'll look into that because that's a fair point. I'd talk about that again.
Speaking of Battle Chasers, like most anticipated sequel, like that probably win my award. Like I keep waiting. I go to their site occasionally to see. No, I'm just waiting for them to announce the Battle Chasers too. But just no.
Seems like they could. Yeah. I'm also, my son has been pressuring me to finish Octopath Traveler on Switch. So, and that's a good game. It slows down a little bit. I'm feeling the grind on it. But I want to do right by him. He wants to do, I guess there's an Octopath randomizer out there that he wants me to try with him. So, I was like, okay, I'm going to take my Switch on my trip. And so I've been trying to get back into it and make some progress on Octopath to try to finish that, because I'm only about halfway through that game. But that was good. That was a solid game too. I really did like that one.
How does the randomizer work for Octopath? Is there a Switch emulator on PC, or is that downloadable on Switch?
Well, I don't know if it actually works on the Switch. He's got it on PC. He got it through Steam, and so it's a Steam mod.
They have a Steam. Yeah, they have. All right, yeah, I forgot they had a release on Steam.
He said he read that there was a way to do it on the Switch, but I'm like, I don't know if I'm gonna go in and tinker with my
Nintendo likes to lock down people who mess with their Switch profiles and things like that.
Exactly. And it's like on a computer I can make up a backup of the game files or re-download easily. If I'm working off a cartridge on my Switch, I'm probably not gonna tinker around with it. But maybe I just buy it on Steam. Like it'll probably go on sale. I'll probably get it for $20 at some point, and between now and when I finish it. So
Smiley, I bet you go to your old park and find that gentleman named Rags. I bet he can modify switches. Probably a skill set he has.
We're not going to go into Rags on this podcast. It's too deep.
Was that Federal?
That's Federal and wherever else you guys were. Broadway and Federal. Anyway. All right. So if you, our listeners, have games, we'd love to hear from you. What games have you guys been trying to finish for the last 5 years and never gotten around to? Drop us a line. We'll have our contact information at the end of the show. We'd love to get some feedback from you. All right. Let's talk about skills. Let's just start off the top. Like, what does it mean to be good at video games? Like, that's, for something that people play for so many different reasons. There's obviously the competitive landscape where esports has actually become a legitimate thing, versus people when you're playing online games, everybody's kind of at a different stage in life, has different reasons for playing. Like, how do you measure something like that? Like, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to be good at video games? Is it more to you about technical prowess, or is it more about how well you play with others. Like there's a lot of things that go into that. So let's just talk about that a little bit. I'm going to start with
We
Van
can
this time.
even, yeah, I was gonna say we can even talk as far as like FPSs, right? There's like cheese weapons that people are like, oh, you continually use that weapon because it's OP or whatnot. Like, can you be good at an OP, or because you use an OP weapon, does that make you good because your KD is high? Like, there's some questions there. I don't want to answer those right now, but I do want to back it up to what does it mean to be good in a video game? And I think that really starts in the early generations of video game development, where in the very beginning it was just accomplishing a task, right? You had Pong or whatnot and you knew what you were supposed to do. But right at like very soon after that, when arcades started popping up and becoming, pretty pretty, like, one of the things that I know developers did to get people to continue to come back and play their game was add a scoring system. And you can literally measure by numerical value how quote unquote good you were at a video game based on your score, right? So how many monsters did you kill throughout the level? Did you have the high score on XYZ? And it started like that, like you're talking about, it started that competition where you go back and see, hey, am I knocked off that top score yet or not? Or somebody does knock you out, you jump back in. So I think it was easily measured then. But even then, I wonder if there's some controversy between a skilled player and somebody who can get high points. And they sound like the same, but they're really not, right? Like,
Not
would
necessarily.
it mean, yeah, would it mean to be skilled to speed run Mario Brothers? Because I've seen some insane speed runs of Mario Brothers. That person's certainly not killing every mob, right? So they're going to have a lower score at the end of the game, as opposed to somebody who sits there, takes their time, kills every mob, and seems less skilled than the other person who had to have just absolute split-second precision timing while trying to traverse the level. So I don't know. I guess I like a good politician answered your question with another question.
Well, it's interesting too because it's kind of developed. I mean, what's the natural progression of the scoring system? I think is now achievements in game. Like that's kind of the new, a similar, like kind of a genesis of that, right? That the scoring led to now achievements being another way you can mark your progress. You can compare to other people. But as we've seen with achievements, there's a lot of different types of achievements in games, and some games the achievements are easier than others. Some like are very very difficult. Others are really not that difficult, but take a ridiculous amount of time. And so it's like, I guess that's another question: is
Yeah,
does something just because something is hard it takes a lot of time investment? Does that make it difficult? Does that
difficult. Yeah.
like is that a skill? Are you skilled because you grinded out the entire sphere grid on Final Fantasy X like they want you to, or do you just not have a life and so you can spend 100 hours
Yeah.
doing something like that? Like, and how's that how do you interpret that? How do you compare that? What do you think, Shai?
Well, and you can even almost when you get into that whole like time spent, you can almost then get into the subcultures that pop up in these especially these grindy games, whether they're MMOs or even JRPGs, where like people find the best ways to like maximize their time. Like what are the best places to go to grind EXP to max your sphere grid? It's like doing arena with these like arts with these characters or whatever. And so like there's that like subset. I have a couple points I want to hit. I'll do one right now. I don't know if we kind of do a round robin, but one thing I want to mention too is like memorization. Like you talk about some of those old arcade games, like a lot of it was just maybe just grinding until you had memorized a layout. And like let's say you were playing one of the original Ninja Gaidens or you're playing Ghost and Goblin, and like it was just pattern recognition and it was like and memorization. And so is that skill or is that just time sunk? And obviously some people can sink the same amount of time and one person will pick it up faster and there is some skill there. But versus playing a game that maybe is more randomized or completely randomized to a certain extent. Nowadays roguelites, that's the whole point of that style of game, right? Is it's a completely random experience whenever you load the game up, and it really kind of tests you to figure to try something new and unexpected.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is, thinking back, especially like the old arcade games and Nintendo games that were very much pattern recognition. There's also the side of it that was like, you do have to understand the pattern and that's how you beat it, but you also have to have the technical dexterity to enact that. Like you have to be able to, I mean, it no different than Final Fantasy 14 boss fights, right? Like you have to identify what you have to do, but then you actually have to execute it repeatedly often until you succeed. And so There's definitely that side of the skill, the probably that's what I think most people would most think of when they think of skill in a video game, right? Is how well you execute what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And like to your point, there's a lot of things that go into that, and some of them are about pattern recognition, and some of them about just critical thinking and being able to make different choices. But in the end, you always have to execute, right?
Well, I guess my second point actually bleeds into that. So let me just bring it up and I'll toss it back to you guys and your thoughts. But I think the ultimate example of pattern recognition versus critical thinking is PvE versus PvP. So something like you said, 14, where maybe it's the same fight in the same order, it's just a matter of getting it down, versus a PvP shooter or like fighting game where like you don't know what the other person's going to do potentially, right? And it's like reacting. Like, would you guys say there's a better example maybe like now of like maybe like skill differential when you get into those kind of that comparison of like PvE versus PvP games?
Yeah, I think so. I completely think like the first game that came to mind was LoL. Like I didn't play a lot of it, but certainly you have to adapt, right? So and I think your skill possibly comes in knowledge of everyone's abilities and the roles that they play within a unit. So maybe knowledge plays a role in your skill so that you can make those quick decisions. Then you also have to make the right decision too, right? So you don't just have to know what it is. You have to, like Smiley mentioned, executing. So I think we're kind of hovering around something here. I don't think we can ever pinpoint it exactly, but it certainly seems like having the mental capacity to make the right choice in the moment is some way of defining skill within a video game.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and all like the best games marry the two, right? I mean, think of any first-person shooter that you play. Like, obviously, your reflexes and your ability to aim, all that's the obvious stuff. But we all know that like map recognition and knowing where things are on the map, where are the good locations, where are the good power-ups, where are the good places to be, where do people spawn, where do they not go that much, like that is part of the game, and that's what differentiates you, where you can be good just because you have quick reflexes, and that can get you far. But when you take that and add it to somebody who really understands all the little things about it, and no different from LoL, right? Like LoL, it's all like, you're right, it's all about knowing the characters and their abilities, but it's also about knowing the map, knowing how the battle flows and where you are as far as where the creeps are pushing, where the jungler are, where we expect everybody's role to be at any point in the game. Like there's that metadata that people who can incorporate that in addition to their skill. And really, again, like you can see like the step by step, like back in the day, in the early day of video games, it was a lot more simple. It was pattern recognition, execute on that pattern. And like those things are still there. They're just a little bit more complex, right?
And I think you bring up LoL. Oh, no, sorry.
I was going to say, real quick comment. It sounds like we need procedurally generated maps in FPS. That would be something.
That would be something, yeah. I mean, if you took that, I mean, what it would do is it would remove it would kind of just disadvantage players who are, like it would make it more about your actual dexterity and your agility in the game. Like, the better players, as far as who's the best at shooting and dodging, right, and using your character abilities, it takes away a level of an advantage for a certain type of gamer, really. Right?
And procedure generated is probably the wrong term. I think it would more be randomized maps. Well, because you're not going to generate it as you traverse it. Like it would in theory exist.
Procedurally generated. Yeah, procedurally generated. I think you're confusing that with something else. Procedurally generated means that it uses an algorithm to determine something. It doesn't necessarily mean it's loading.
You were right.
In of itself. It just means that like.
I know. I just felt like it wasn't exactly what I meant, because when I think of procedural generation, I think of Minecraft as the world develops in front of you. Whereas I don't expect that for this game. I expect the map to be randomized in the beginning and everybody loads into it instantaneously. We're getting into semantics. So yes, it was a fine example. I just felt like I needed to clarify a little more.
It's it's funny because I think what you said was 100% correct, and you
but we don't need to
generation
you were right, but now you're correcting yourself into an erroneous explanation.
Right.
Oh, okay.
So, all right.
You thought wrong. You spoke correctly.
To get us back on track, though, like I think one last thing we could. I think Van's right. I think there's one component missing though we haven't really talked about, and I think you touched on it early on, Smiley. And I think Van mentioning LoL was perfect, because like League of Legends is honestly a great example. You have the knowledge, you have the reaction speed, you have like the critical thinking, but also there's the communication. And I think like that's more and more nowadays. Communication actually also can make you skilled. And like honestly, if you're playing a cooperative if you're playing a cooperative game, it's almost necessary. Like in League of Legends, you could have like the best player on your team, but if you guys aren't communicating, like they could just be sitting out there doing nothing potentially, or get ganked by the whole other team and get destroyed because no one's letting them know what's going on. So I think that's like still that's a key component in the whole formula.
Yeah, and this isn't a shocker at all, but every single one of the best squads I've ever played in FPS have communicated, right? Like, whether it's PlanetSide or Battlefield or whatnot, when you're in a squad, good communication was the key to our success. And some stuff.
Even when we started playing League of Legends early on, like, it was a differentiator for us in the lower ranks when we were communicating and we were playing against people who were just not. You know, like you knew that you could tell the difference. Yeah. And then once we got a little bit higher and we were playing against other people who also communicated well, is when that advantage dropped off. I think it was very noticeable.
Yep.
But that rolls right in. I mean, I think that communication is a great segue into our next point, which is about how skill affects your relationship. So what actually brought this entire podcast up, I think, is we were kind of just talking about is our friendship to a degree based on our skill at Final Fantasy XI. One thing that we kind of noticed is that, you know, part of what brought us together was the fact that Final Fantasy XI was such a game that required so much teamwork. Like, you literally could not, especially early on in that game, you know, now it's a lot different, but, you know, in the early days, you couldn't accomplish anything really by yourself. You know, certain specialized classes maybe could, but for the most part, you needed a team, and it took a long time to do anything. And so partying with people who were competent and communicated well and weren't jackasses really made the gaming experience much more enjoyable, and you just accomplished so much more. And so that's kind of what brought us together, right? Like, part of the reasons we became friends is because we could count on each other. And as we've grown through gaming, like, the people we've invited and kind of brought into the fold have been also people that we've partied with and been like, oh, this person's they're pretty good, they're cool, like, let's do more stuff with them. You know, so what do you guys think about that like, it's not something I don't think any of us ever like externalized, if that makes sense. It's not like we overly said, oh, this person's a good player, I want to be friends with him. But like, it was more like a subtle thing that kind of tied us together, which I wouldn't have expected until we talked about it, that like, oh, you know, like, the fact that you guys are good at that game is kind of why we were friends in the first place.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, and I think
right? It seems weird.
Yeah, it's fun, and it's funny when you say it out loud. But I think you, in my opinion, as I was listening to you talk, I kind of had a realization that, as you mentioned, it wasn't one thing. Like, we didn't play with each other once and then say, "Hey, I'm going to be friends because that person's great." It was that we can continually count on that individual to accomplish things with you, because like you mentioned, there wasn't much you could do on your own, so you always needed to reach out to one or two or three or sometimes up to 5 additional people to accomplish something. And because the stakes were so high, a lot of times it could have been items that you grinded for hours to acquire just to attempt this one fight. You wanted to bring the best team possible, and in my opinion, that always meant bringing you two plus whoever else. And I think what ended up just happening over time was, because my go-to was always you two plus whomever, like, we just spent more time together. So I think skill probably was the catalyst, but then friendship evolved from just the time, communication, jokes, laughter, achievements even, that we had during all of it. So,
well, in addition to ability too, I think there's the competency that comes along with just reliability, right? Like, that's a game too, where, I mean, it was always it was kind of a joke in the game, right? Where somebody would level up and it's like, oh, now I gotta go, my stars, something's come up, see ya, you know.
Yeah.
And like people didn't hang around, and they got theirs, and they didn't always hang around for everybody else to get their achievements. So having people that stuck with you and were around for the long haul and were around consistently and didn't flake out on you all the time, like, that was a valuable addition. Was just somebody who's like, oh yeah, this person's actually going to hang around and be here for the 3 hours we agreed upon, and not duck out after 20 minutes, because that was a huge time sink. When somebody left the party unexpectedly, you get all the way out there, and then you go 20 minutes, and then they level up and leave, and you're like, all right, now we gotta find a replacement, and then you're sitting around with your thumb up your ass for 40 minutes trying to get somebody to come in there. Like, that was awful. Like, so much wasted time.
Yeah,
I
mean, no, you didn't cut me off. I agree. I think skill definitely played a part. I think that Van hit the nail on the head with the stakes. I think that's one thing that we'll agree that, like, 11, especially versus like 14, a big differential was, we've talked about this last podcast, about how 14 was kind of like, you wipe, you just start right up, you just try again, you wipe, you start up. With 11, like Van said, you could put hours into preparing for one attempt at one fight, and so the stakes were huge. And sometimes it would rely on one person on a certain job hitting the right skill at the right time, and knowing. And I think that's what's different about, especially with like 11 with skill. It wasn't so much like your reaction speed; it was like your focus and your preparation. Yes, so like we knew that if like Rido, another friend of the podcast, was on Black Mage, that he was sitting there with his finger ready to hit that stun button, and he'd always get it. And like we could count on him to do it. Versus like we pulled in a pug, like they might miss that by like a second, and like we would wipe. And so you know, just it was stuff like that. But I think, and this is going to go a little off track, because I think that the skill definitely played a huge part, but to me it was always that you guys cared, if that makes sense. I think that there was always, especially 11 made a big difference with this because of how time intensive it was, and how much like work you had to put into like map knowledge, and like knowing where you were going, or being prepared with food and all that stuff, that like people would take forever to get places. Like they would take the wrong route, or they get lost on a map, or they wouldn't bring food, or all this stuff. But like I feel like the friends that we developed a circle was like, people always showed up prepared, and people always like wouldn't like knew their job, or they always, I don't know, like. And I think that always meant a lot to me. And I think over the years, that's something I've always like valued is, and I think I have known that, versus like maybe like the skill was maybe subconscious. It was like, oh yeah, this person like really like, they value other people's time and other people's, their preparation as well. So I think that played a big part.
When we saw the other side of that, right? That the people that we reviled online, the people that we were probably hardest on, the ones who have become memes among us, as I keep referencing Fight Wait Me as a good example. Like, what was that guy's name?
Mike Joyful.
Mike Joyful, right? Who we've joked about for years.
Hold on, just pause for a second. Imagine him listening to this podcast.
Nobody listens to this podcast.
Mike Joyful, you've lived.
No, I'm not saying what you're going to say. Like,
you've
what
lived
a
in
mind
infamy.
blow that would be for him. Like, what if you were listening to a podcast and a decade later, people bring up your in-game name?
Boss Bacon, that guy was a huge.
Just
dig.
wait for the comment on this episode. Fight Wait Me.
Yeah.
Dude, so if anybody does listen to this podcast, they're going to make it their best attempt to find Mike Joyful. This is going to go on Reddit, and everybody's going to look for Mike Joyful.
Good luck communicating with him. But that's a whole point, right? Like, why has he become a meme among us? Because he was completely unprepared for the fight. He was just some dude who we tried to do something with one time. Mm-hmm. He was completely unprepared for the fight, took forever, was late, couldn't find his way through the map to where we are, communicated horribly in this weird broken English, and was just like became a joke among us, that because of all the things that Shy just hit upon, right? All the things that we did well and counted on for each other became very obvious and almost comical when people don't do like what we considered simple things that a good player does. And so because of that, I think we really kind of formed an in-group of good players, and I think maybe that's a little bit why we were, we've talked in the past about how in Final Fantasy 11 especially, we were a little bit merciless with other players, right? We kind of took what we wanted, and whether it was a camp or a mob. Like, I mean, it's kind of a survival of the fittest thing, and we kind of had a group of very highly skilled players that allowed us to do that, and we were a little bit contemptuous of players who didn't put in the same work.
Would you do that again today?
No, I don't think so. I wouldn't want to. I like to think that I've grown as a person.
So I think we would, and the only reason I think we would is because I feel like it would be like it's part of the game, right? The challenge, like you're fighting for this camp just like we are. I don't know.
It kind of depends. It kind of depends. I think there was a difference because I mean we weren't always like that. Like I remember boy, there was a really interesting.
It was Z's poll day. That was just insane. Where Z was jacking all the Calibri from everybody.
I was thinking of a different time, and I think this was after you quit, Van. But like there was a time when you might remember this, Shy, when they had that Shadow Lord fight in the past.
Oh yeah, the line.
But there were only 3 instances, and it was like a limited time event. So it was something where like it took weeks, where if you could take over all of the areas in Conquest, then you pushed to the next area. And if you could hold that for a week, you pushed to Shadow Lord. And if you did that, you'd have 1 week, 1 Conquest period, where everybody could fight this special boss and get some really good stuff. And so, like, you didn't even know how often that would happen. So everybody was bombing that, and they only had 3 instances. Only 3 parties could be fighting at once. And so, like, people were up at the top of Castles of All, and there was just a line of parties waiting to go in.
Oh my gosh.
Hundreds of people. And it was such an interesting social experiment because there's nobody there to enforce that line.
Right. There's nobody
So
there.
you're waiting in line. Other dudes and they just run up and spam their way in and cut you. And so it became kind of like, I remember when we first started doing that, we were interested in waiting our turn. Like, we weren't being dicks about it. Like, we got in line and waited. But then as soon as it became clear that other people were just cutting us relentlessly, then it became kind of chaos, because it's like, well, what am I just going to sit here like a schmuck and just let people keep cutting me and never get a turn? Like, no, of course, like, you kind of have to. And then people started yelling at us for cutting, but we're like, what are we supposed to do here? Like, it was such I always remember that as like the lawlessness of the internet. What an interesting situation where there's really no way to enforce, because there's no PvP in Final Fantasy 11. So like, you couldn't like take matters into your own hand. And it really, I don't know, that's probably a different podcast. I'm kind of getting us a little bit of field here, but it reminded me of that. Like, what a strange situation like that was. And what made me think of it is that you asked me that question, and I feel like it kind of depends on the context, right? Like, I mean, if the game is set up where it's like you're encouraged to compete, like, heck yeah, like, I'm obviously a very, very competitive person. Anybody will tell you that. But like, I also believe that you can be polite too. Like, there's such thing as manners, and if like there's kind of a agreed upon norm. Like, I don't want to be the bull in the china shop that just says, no, I do it my way. Like, I've come at least that far since our FFXI days.
I would also say I think a large part of that would determine like on other friends of the podcast who be playing with us, because I think certain individuals might have more of an effect on us being more aggressive or playing more in that style.
Maybe. That's a good point. That's
a very good point.
So I want to go back to skill and party makeup dynamic or whatnot.
Please.
There's another point that I want to make or a question that I want to pose to both of you, and I guess it's a loaded question because I already set myself on an answer. Like, we talked about how skill brought us together. We were able to rely and depend on each other and whatnot, and then friendship just evolved from that. There's also been instances of very well skilled players who not necessarily everybody didn't like to play with, but a lot of people didn't enjoy their company, and yet they were invited over and over again. So it just goes to show like how powerful skill is, right? Like, what skill does.
We need an after podcast discussion about this.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
I think I have an idea.
I'm talking about a few.
I think I have an idea.
But it's just an interesting point, right? That you will invite people that you don't enjoy being around because they are skilled individuals.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I think something is worth.
Go ahead.
I think a disclaimer we should make just for our audience who doesn't maybe know our gaming history and whatever, and maybe this really gets. Actually, I think I'm bleeding into. Never mind. I'm bleeding into our next topic. So never mind. You go, Smiley.
Let me go real fast. Then I'll say that I think on top of that, like, you're right. We definitely put up with people who were skilled who maybe we didn't like as much personally. I think the inverse was also true too, though. Like, there was a lot of times, especially I think about Final Fantasy 14. Being the case, but a little bit in 11. I don't think you got super into the end game with 11, but it happened more, I think, for Shy and I when we were doing like Abyssia and stuff. That like, we definitely put up with people because we needed the body or we needed the job. Like, I can think of a couple healer jobs that we brought to like raid in 14 to Bahamut's Coil, who clearly most of us did not really like, but we didn't have anybody in that role. We needed an eighth person. We needed a healer. They weren't like their skill. Part of I think the reason we didn't like them is because their skill wasn't maybe that great in a lot of cases. But like we didn't have a better option, so the game kind of forced us to it's like, are we going to wait around for the perfect person and not play, or are we going to take what we can get? So it's kind of interesting how, the other side of it is how skill makes you feel about, a lack of skill perhaps makes you feel about people and how you treat them and how hard it can be for them to break into then that circle of friends if they don't kind of live up to a certain level of competency.
Yeah.
But go ahead. So Shai, if you want to kind of transition.
Yeah, I think I was going to segue us kind of because what I was going to say, and I think I need to clarify. This is like a double disclaimer. So this is I do believe. I think next on our outline we're going to talk about perceptions of skill in ourselves and others, and I think maybe that's also game based, and I think we might get into some more practical examples. But like that very much depends on the game, in my opinion. And so like I do think that in 11 we were up there in skill, and just like, and I think because in 11 it wasn't once again so much reaction speed or whatever, it was like game knowledge and like just proficiency and like and time spent, like, and we were all dedicated, like we worked on getting our gear and our merit points and all that stuff. Now you go to a game like 14 where like the game is it removed a lot of that. It removed a lot of the time spent and whatever. Well, I mean, not to a certain extent. Like there was it was like a curve of like, you could, if you weren't skilled, you had to spend a lot of time, but if you were extremely skilled, you didn't have to spend as much time. And I think that's where like the raiding scene was so interesting, was you had the best groups like clearing these raids in like weeks, like right? They release a new or days or weeks, and then we'd be in a prog group, we'd form a little static, and we're like, weeks if not a month in, like, getting to the point of clearing or close to clearing. And so like I just wanted to make sure, like, I was about to like make a disclaimer to the audience being like, hey, we're not saying we're like even the most skilled players in a lot of the games we play. And I think, but then that made me realize it's based on the game, and then that comes down to self-perception. Like I think like I especially with 14, I don't see myself as an extremely skilled player since I'm still playing it. Like there are people out there in 14 who are just ridiculous, and I'm just happy to be in like a whatever percentile of that game. But yeah, that was kind of my segue, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think that's a great thing because I mean, for a long time before the age of multiplayer, like where you felt you ranked on skill at video games was kind of hard to tell, like especially if you didn't have a ton of friends that played video games. Like I think, and I'll be interested to hear what Van thinks about this, because I know you actually had people you played video games with as a child, whereas I didn't really. Like I had like one friend who was a little bit into games, but like, I grew up in a small town. There's only a couple guys who lived near me when I was a kid who were my close friends, and they just weren't that into games that much the way I was. And so like I didn't, like my skill was kind of measured by how far I could do in games, but like I never really knew like that much. Like, am I really good at Mario Brothers, or am I like, I mean, I've beaten it, like, like you didn't have the same people to compare against like you do now with the internet. Like to Van's point earlier, you can go out and see some really crazy stuff on all these games, people doing ridiculous stuff. But when I was a kid, it was like either I knew somebody who was better than me or worse than me, maybe, for me to compare. But otherwise, I just kind of had to get a feel for it. Like, what was your experience, Van? Like, do you feel like, based on the people you played with, that your friends, were you all kind of the same skill level, or did you feel like, oh man, like I'm really not good at this game because my friend kicks major ass, or maybe the opposite? Like,
yeah, I'd say this actually supports Shai's comment that it really depends on the genre.
Yeah,
because I would say up until FPS, I was not the best at my group in anything. So whether it was fighter or side-scrolling platform or anything like that, I was very humbled by how good they were, and I was able to define their goodness by, again, the finesse at which they complete a level. Right, they're not dying often. They are able to complete the level in the first place and stuff like that, where I wouldn't. And then of course the Street Fighters in the arcades and whatnot. Like my brother was just amazing, and I knew he was amazing. And like some of my most fondest memories of video games in general was being at the bowling alley on Saturday morning, and my brother being at the what's it called at the Street Fighter arcade game with a line of people wanting to play with him, and all the quarters lined up all the quarters lined up on
He
the
was the
dash.
champ.
And it
that
was
people
he
wanted
was
to
the
go up
one who
against.
everybody always
Wow.
wanted to go up against. It was so cool. So it was clear, and he's still that good today. Like, it is clear how good he is at these fighting games. Like, he will purposely not play his best trio depending on what version or whatnot. In any of the fighting games, he won't play his best character because, like, literally there's no challenge at all. Like, to anybody, any of my, not to you, of course, I haven't play against you guys, but within our circle, and that expands to maybe even like 8 people we used to consistently play with. He was just by far better than even the next best person. So I was always humbled in fighting games with him, and then I'd be able to hold my own against the rest of the people. So I knew I wasn't good at fighting games. I was okay. So yeah, there was certainly a measure there. I never felt good at anything until FPS came along, and it really shone in Counter-Strike when I used to spend all my time in internet cafes because my computer wasn't good enough, internet wasn't good enough, that a commercial broadband internet was the fastest thing you can get at the time. So we would spend our $1.25 an hour to use somebody else's computer in an internet cafe and play Counter-Strike with other people. That's when I noticed that, hey, I'm getting a pretty good KD ratio, right, kill death ratio, and the team that I'm on, again, communicating and whatnot, we're winning pretty frequently, and then that's really where I felt like my skill shined, and still to this day, I feel like I'm pretty proficient in FPS. But take that genre away, I would consider myself just an average player, and it was very humbling seeing the other people I used to grow up with playing video games. So,
What about you, Shy?
Yeah, I mean, we moved around. I think I'm in a similar situation to you, Smiley, maybe a little bit different, but like we moved around so much growing up that we didn't have I didn't have a lot of like childhood friends because we were just like moving around the country, like, and whatnot. But I think it was when I went to college and I met my college roommate and friend of the podcast, Rido, who was already been mentioned once, that I kind of like, and also like was living on a dorm with a bunch of other guys who gamed, that I kind of got a sense for my skill. And what was odd is, early on, I thought I was actually pretty good at games, and really, honestly, the game that stood out to me was Warcraft 3 at the time. I'd played a ton of Warcraft 3 in high school, just like single player. Like, I know a lot of friends, but I would just play single player against computer and whatnot. And like, I got there and you could play LAN, and some of the other guys said Warcraft 3, and like the guys on the hall, like I would just destroy them to one point where like, like me and 3 other guys were playing, and they all formed a secret alliance to like attack my base all together. Even like we were playing 2v2, but my ally like. I think he like switched teams mid game, so it was all 3 of them versus me, and I was so pissed. I couldn't take a joke. I regret my reaction to it. But man, Rido is someone who I do feel is better at pretty much any game than I. And that came out pretty early on, and like it really frustrated me, I think, when we would play like any kind of competitive game, because I just didn't feel like I stood a chance, and it really, like, I came to the point where I didn't want to play competitive games against him because it was just frustrating. It was like I just knew I was going to lose. Why even try? And I think that's what was really cool about 11 and why I really got into it, and it really helped kind of sustain our friendship, was like it was a game we played together, and I knew he was good, and it was something I could do well at, and so like together, like we could really power through that game. And we did play just the 2 of us for like a year before we met you guys and really kind of joined a larger group. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the games that like I didn't really ever think about there being not games, genres that I didn't really think about there being that much of a differentiation in skill was RPGs. You know, I kind of feel like, yeah, like there's people who are crazy who do like low level challenges and stuff, but like it wasn't until I had a number of different people, like I had like 5 or 6 different people who test out my Rainwalkers RPG and do some play testing for me. And of course I watched them very carefully, and I knew everything there was to know about that game because I crafted it myself. And like what a difference there is in people in how they approach an RPG, and like how some people are so thorough and meticulous and found every treasure, every secret bit of dialogue, every little thing I put in there, versus other people who would just like completely just like blitz past stuff and be like, well, they're okay, they're not even gonna check that pot to see if anything's in it. All right, like not gonna talk to that guy, he's got a quest for you, that's all right, don't worry about it. Like, you know, like I never realized that there actually is a skill level in an RPG as far as like how complete you go through it and how much stuff you find. And that was very eye-opening. I mean, that was only a couple of years ago that I did that, so I mean I was into my 30s before I really ever thought that there was a real differentiation other than like really, you know, people like who are like pushing themselves to, you know, beat RPGs without winning fights and stuff like that, low level challenges.
Can I return back to the beginning of our conversation when we were talking about general skill and bring up a couple new categories?
Yeah, hoping you would say that, Smiley. I don't want to go back.
This podcast moves only forward. Only ever moves forward. The path of the warrior. No,
well,
go
I
ahead.
think two things that we didn't discuss that are worth considering as far as skill in games as well. One you just brought up, and I think it's not even just like not so much like you mentioned it as almost like completion, like completing an RPG, but I think you'd have to even like talk about like self-motivation versus like people who would just pick up a strategy guide and just follow the strategy guide to like play through an RPG versus someone who's like, I'm going to go into this RPG and like I'm going to try to discover everything myself. Like I don't know if that's a skill, maybe that's a whole different mindset. But the one thing I wanted to talk about, we didn't get to, Van made a comment in the very beginning. We were talking about skill. You mentioned like cheese guns and like FPSs, and I think something that's worth talking about is like skill ceilings in games and how like a lot of times, especially this, you see this with like MMOs, like classes in MMOs almost always have a ranking, a difficulty ranking, and it's almost like easier classes have like a higher skill base, so like they're easier to do well at. But if you master them, maybe they can't do as well. But then like as you get play more difficult classes, like if you're not good, you won't do as good as like the easier classes. But if you're really good, you'll do better. Yeah. And just like I think the same thing with like guns. I think in FPSs, or maybe even like there's I think a lot of correlations to that. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about that. Just like the effective skill ceilings in games, or how you've seen that play out.
Go ahead, Van.
No, go ahead, Smiley. Take it away.
I think that. For sure, like that's how these games are designed, right? Like, I mean, a good game, a well-designed game, a well-balanced game. People always talk, especially in PvP, about balance between classes, balance between characters, things like that. Like that's what you strive for, right? Like the goal in my mind is that if the easier it is to pick up and kind of be proficient at, like the lower of a ceiling you want that to have. You want to reward people who can do something exceptional with a character, who can really take the time and have the skill to really play something that's more difficult, or maybe takes a little extra thought or attention to really get the most out of. And then but you want to be rewarded for that. Like that's kind of where this idea of cheese guns comes from, right? Like if the best weapon is also the easiest to use and the most mindless, that's the definition of a cheese weapon, right? Like, because you say it takes no skill to get the ultimate result. And that's considered bad game design, right? Like you want people to feel rewarded, to say, I'm doing something that most people can't, and I'm getting a benefit out of that. I'm doing better than somebody who is doing something easier. They can't reach as high as me because they haven't put in the same level of work or effort or whatever. So 100% think that's all about good game design. And Van?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think you both nailed it on the head, and I know I brought it up in the beginning. So
yep. Is there any? So we talked a little bit. I want to get a little bit more into like personal experiences and stuff. And so like, are there any times like Van kind of already shared one with his brother, like seeing his brother, in the arcade facing challengers, where that's kind of a time when you kind of have measured yourself. Like, is there any other times where you feel like you leveled up, where like, was there a game you played that you felt like I can go back and point to this game that made me better at this genre or something? Like for me, to give an example, the one I think of is Lunar, the Silver Star Story, which I mentioned earlier in the pod, oddly enough. That was a game that I feel like Working Designs, who was the developer, the localizer of that game, did such a great job with the character dialogue, where up till that point in RPGs, I kind of didn't really talk to NPCs like ever, unless I had to for a quest progression or something. Like, for just coming from old school RPGs, like for the most part, they didn't say anything that you really cared about that you couldn't just figure out by playing the game. But in Lunar, like the characters were just so interesting, and every time like that's one of the things I love about the game is like every single NPC is worth talking to, because it develops your characters, and like your characters interact with them and they interact with each other, and it just makes for and like the dialogue's very funny. And so it changed the way I played RPGs. It's why I think I became much more detailed, and I checked everything, and I talked to everybody, and I went everywhere, because that game made me want to. And then like I realized the benefits of that, where then you get items from dudes who give you stuff, and you find out information that maybe you would have missed. So that's like a game I think of when I think of like what made me better at RPGs, what put me in a position to be able to design ones that I think are good. Like I always think back to Lunar and how that game just made it so much fun to talk. You just wanted to get to a new town. Like, it's the first game I ever played where I was more excited to get to a town than a dungeon, because I was more excited to talk to the people than to actually fight, which was completely reversed going back to every other RPG I'd ever played. So,
Yeah,
you guys have any? Go ahead.
yeah, I have an experience, and it goes back to FPS. And again, like I said, I would confidently say I'm better than average, but I wouldn't say I'm the best in the world, or even top 90 percentile. But what was the kicker was transitioning from controllers to mouse keyboard. So it was the peripheral transition. Okay. So in the beginning, when we were playing like Call of Duty on like shit, or even GoldenEye or whatnot. GoldenEye. Yeah, was it PlayStation? Yeah,
GoldenEye would have been N64. I think the first Call of
Duty was
PlayStation.
I think Call of Duty was PlayStation also, because I remember using the PlayStation controllers. Yeah. So when I'm on that, I was okay. I wouldn't even say good, to be honest. Like, it was, and even to this day, like, I played Destiny with you a lot.
Yeah.
I still hated playing on controllers so much that I went out and bought that Zim 4, which allowed me to use the mouse and keyboard on just because I knew what I could do with a mouse and keyboard and what I wasn't doing because I had controllers in my hand. And yet I know there's still a lot of people who prefer controllers over mouse and keyboard, but yet I feel like mouse and keyboard is it's the cheese gun of FPSs, in my opinion. It gives you an edge.
Secret weapon.
Don't. Yeah. And yet a lot of people prefer controllers. I don't know. Anyways, it's a big ramble, but yeah, so that was my moment, was when it was Counter-Strike came out. I'm playing in internet cafes. Now I'm on mouse and keyboard as opposed to controllers in my hand, and it certainly just felt so much more comfortable. A world of a difference instantly.
I don't know that I have a story about like leveling up or unlocking. I think that my story would be, once again, going back to number one game of all time, Ninja Gaiden. That's the one game. That's the first game I ever played that I think I played on more than normal. I think when I'd played games leading up to that, there were difficulties. I may have played on easy just because I was more interested in story before that game, and then maybe normal. I don't know, but like that game, it was so interesting because I enjoyed that game so much. I think it wasn't even just because of the difficulty. It was just, it felt so good, and it also was just gorgeous for the time. And I love graphics, but like it was so weird seeing other people have a hard time with the game because the game just felt natural to me. And so then like I started playing on hard, and I think I beat the game on hard, and then I started playing on very hard, and I didn't get very far on very hard, but like that game was hard. But like that game was kind of like a switch in my mindset as far as difficulty. I do have a Van Street Fighter story I want to share though, and I think a story that we were all there for actually, but I wanted to make sure I fit this in this episode, and just watching someone else who I feel like has mastered a game just like show their skill. And I think I wanted to call out a friend of the podcast, Reichi, and a game we all played together, Terra.
Which one?
And watching like talking about skill caps in a game, Reichi right off the bat chose the hardest class to play in that game, which was Warrior, and it was supposed to be a damage dealer and a tank, but it just required such infinitesimal knowledge of like the game mechanics and patterns. And I remember specifically us doing like a hard mode dungeon at end game. All of us were like pushing our limits, and if I remember correctly, we wiped on a boss, and he basically soloed I think like the last 10 to 20% of this boss.
It was that giant eye dude, right?
We're all just lying dead on the ground. Dude, like there's no way he should have been able to finish this thing, but he did. And it was just like, it was like in that moment I already knew he was good. I already knew he was way better than I was, but I was like, I'm glad we're playing with him, because like, I mean, this guy, like, he was just, I don't know, someone I completely respect, someone I know is better at games than I am, but like that was just like that example of like watching someone like play at their full potential. And just,
dude, I'll tack onto that, because I started that game, I believe I started on Slayer, but I also was dinking around on Warrior, and when I watched him solo some BAMs on Warrior, I would like, it inspired me to pick up that class. I was like, that is so amazing. I want to do that. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it the way he did it. I was passable, and like it was awesome, but like he had that job down so well, and it was a perfect example of a class that like, that game, as we talked about, like if you wanted to tank, you could tank sufficiently on like, what was it, Lancer, I think, with the big arm.
Oh yeah, that's where you just absorb damage. Yeah, it was like a paladin
absorb the damage, and like you could do that, and it really wasn't that hard, and you could be passable. But if you really wanted to push the limits of what was possible, you could be Warrior, and you could basically tank anything in the game, as he proved in that fight, where he basically tanked like a super boss, and like he made it look so easy.
Yeah.
And like I remember like just like thinking like I remember how excited I was when I decided to take Warrior, and I was just like kind of dreaming about like I'm gonna get so good at this and I'm gonna play so hard, I'm gonna get so and I'm gonna be like the PvP god out here, like no one's gonna be like touch me, and I'm just gonna be like, because we remember we came from Black Desert a little bit and some other games where we kind of got chased a little bit in PvP. Like even in Terra itself, there were times like I remember we did some Vanarchy stuff where like in PvP zones where like we kind of weren't the best PvP group. We kind of got terrorized a little
I
bit.
suck at PvP.
And
I am
me
absolutely
too.
terrible at
Me too.
PvP.
We never really had that killer instinct, and we kind of got bullied a little bit from time to
Yeah.
time. And I remember thinking like, oh man, I'm gonna be the freaking enforcer. Like no one's gonna be able to touch me. And like I tried, and I wasn't able to like put that into action ever. Like on like I was at best I was like 60% of what Ray could do. Like that cat was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
great.
exactly.
That's a great anecdote. That is a great story and a great boy. Is there a game that Ray plays that he's not a wizard?
That's what he
at?
said. Like,
That
I'm going
guy-
to talk about an amazing thing that Ray did, and I'm like,
Yeah,
okay,
like
what
which
game?
one? Yeah, I like that answer.
Yeah.
I like that answer.
Ray was. It's amazing that Ray put up with us. Like we talked about how skill makes friendships, and
Yeah.
lack of skill is the basis for ostracization. It's amazing that he stayed with us and kept playing.
We
with
were the
us.
like, imagine
five
what
he
he
put
was-
up with all the time. And like he's like, well, I
Yeah.
can't do stuff without him,
wasn't
I
like
guess. So
Yeah, like imagine Ray in a party with 5 other Rays.
No.
Like
Oh.
that would have been something else.
Well, I mean, those are the kind of people that Shai was talking about who do
knocking out
world
raids
first.
in a week or a day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I mean, the best of the best, and I think that's the thing about us. Like, I mean, if it hasn't been clear to anybody listening, like I think obviously varies very much from game to game, but I think in the MMORPG realm, which is where we have spent the most time together, I think we're probably like 70 to 90 range percentile, right? Like we're not the
For
tip
PvE.
top
Yeah.
for PvE. Yeah, we're not the tip top content pushing, but we're right. We're a step behind. You know, we're not the best, but we hold ourselves to a high standard and we play pretty well. I think that's how we see ourselves, and I think it's fairly accurate
Yeah,
for
I'd
the
agree
most
with that
part.
100%.
Probably varies from game to game, but
Yeah.
we're probably higher in 11. Probably not quite as high
Yeah.
in some of the other games we played since, just because we didn't put the time and you know, we didn't put 10 years of our life into some of these other games like we did 11. So
Yeah.
all right. You know, one of the other things I want to talk about to shift gears to MMO first-person shooters is PlanetSide, because you know we all played PlanetSide together, and that was an interesting game because it felt like you really were such a small part of a larger front that your own personal skill didn't come into it as much as your coordination, and you could kind of achieve more as a group of less skilled players than maybe in other first-person shooters. So. Did you guys have anything you want to talk about with PlanetSide? Memories of that, or
Yeah, I
you know,
think
experiences
I
with
think
that?
as you mentioned, just strength in numbers in that game, that it was the unit that made it powerful and not the individual. So now instead of taking an individual in like a 20v20, we're talking 100v100 or something like that. Like your percentage of weight is much less reduced. However, when you're in a group of other individuals, then you make up that difference again. So I think really that game was heavily regulated by your coordination within platoons, and you can have up to 30 people in a single
so.
unit or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, it was out of
Pretty
control.
big.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think that the nature of the game took. I mean, I enjoyed PlanetSide too. That's one of my favorite first-person shooters because I didn't
Love
feel
it.
like my lack of skill
fun.
in the first-person shooter genre hindered anyone. Like it was more of like our coordination, our working together was where we got stuff done.
I agree, and that's I think why I probably have played that FPS with you guys more than any other, is because I'm, I am commensurately bad as you know. Van is a step above in FPSs. I'm probably a step below. I'm I can be streaky. I can get on a hot streak, but it doesn't happen that often. I'm
Yeah,
consistent.
but I love playing with you because you get so excited when you get a kill.
Just you don't get that many. You got to savor them, you know. But yeah, like I think in PlanetSide too, like yeah, it wasn't as frustrating for that reason. My lack of skill was kind of offset, and so I felt like I could contribute more. and not be weighing the
Yeah, or you
team
could be
down.
like Sheeny, and she barely had her rifle out. She was always running around with the machine gun or
Medic
laying
or-
landmines.
Tank
or-
mines.
not a
Oh
machine
my
gun,
gosh.
Yeah, she was always laying landmines. I remember we'd roll onto someplace 20 minutes later, and all of a sudden,
Oh, yeah.
you would see.
You and I'd be running maxes on a tower, and she'd be like, "I'll be back. I'm gonna drop some mines and get 2 more kills. I'll be back. Back to repair you guys." Yeah. A maniac.
Funny.
All right, gentlemen. Anything else you want to contribute to this conversation before we let the kind people know how they can give us their feedback?
I'm just amazed we were able to fill an hour.
as always, as you always are. You're always surprised.
I'm not gonna lie. I feel like we could do another podcast about some, like, even just stories. Like, honestly, just like multiplayer stories from games. There's just like a bunch of stories I want to talk about, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll have a story time episode.
There you go.
It'd be good to forewarn people about that.
Yeah.
This is just going to be senseless ramblings of things that you didn't.
Inside baseball. and-
That's
yeah.
it's gonna be a normal episode, guys. Okay.
Right. Just like every other episode. But at least we'll own it in that light. So, all right. Well, if you have any rambling stories you'd like to tell us about your experiences with difficulty, with multiplayer, with skill, anything related, we'd love to hear about that. You can get a hold of us in the normal ways on Twitter at Focus Target, on YouTube. The Focus Target podcast is our YouTube page, and all of our previous episodes are up there. Some of the streams we've done are up there, so check that out if you're interested. We can be contacted by email. FocusTargetPodcast@gmail.com is the best way to get a hold of us. And of course, we are streaming this live on Twitch, twitch.tv/Focus Target Podcast. And we also, like I said, we haven't been streaming as much lately. I know, Shai, did you ever get any streaming in? You said you were going to do a little streaming on War of the Visions,
Not
but
yet.
I don't feel like
Not
I saw
yet.
your notification.
No. Yeah.
Not yet.
That's still maybe in the works. Yeah.
The people are waiting, bro.
You gotta.
People
The
are
thing with
waiting.
War of the Visions, there's weekly stuff. So it's like Wednesdays or Thursdays are like the time to do
Oh,
streams.
yeah.
So like tomorrow morning I might stream a little bit. I don't know, but like
There you go.
those are the opportunities.
All right, but check us out on Twitch, check us out on YouTube, and of course we would love to hear from you if you want to send us an email or a tweet. So episode 87, Focus Target Podcast. We're climbing towards 100. Thanks for being with us here today. I hope you had a good time with us. I am your host, Smiley.
This is Shy.
And I'm Van. As always, cover us, Porkins. We're out.